It all began in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The kind of place where every lawn was trimmed with military precision, mailboxes matched in design, and even the flower beds looked like they had been approved by some secret board of judges. That wasn't far from the truth because the community was under the control of a homeowners association. And in this particular neighborhood, the HOA wasn't just strict, it was practically tyrannical. At the center of it all was a woman who had earned herself the nickname Karen long before the internet made it a meme. Karen wasn't technically the president of the HOA, but she might as well have been. She attended every meeting, knew every clause of the bylaws by heart, and enforced rules like she was a sheriff in some dusty frontier town. Residents whispered that she spent more time walking the streets looking for violations than she did inside her own home. Nothing escaped her gaze. A trash can left out too long, a hedge trimmed unevenly, even a car parked at a slightly wrong angle. To Karen, everything was a personal offense against the neighborhood's standards. Into this overly polished world moved a man named Mark, who had recently inherited a piece of property from his late uncle. The house was modest but charming, with a large backyard that extended into a stretch of land most neighbors ignored. Unlike others on the block, Mark wasn't interested in perfection. He was practical, laid back, and a little eccentric. That eccentricity was most obvious when, a few weeks after moving in, he introduced the neighborhood to his unusual companion, a donkey named Jasper. Jasper wasn't just a pet. Mark had grown up around animals, and Jasper had been his uncle's faithful farm companion for years. To Mark, the donkey wasn't livestock, it was family. He built a sturdy pen in the backyard, complete with shelter, shade, and a feeding station. Jasper was content, braying loudly from time to time, trotting along the fence line and munching happily on hay. Children from nearby houses found Jasper fascinating. Some of them would run up to the fence just to see him, giggling when he let out his distinctive, almost comical brays. Of course, while the children loved Jasper, the adults were less enthusiastic. And no one was more outraged than Karen. She saw the donkey not as a quirky addition to the neighborhood, but as a direct violation of what she called community standards. From the moment Jasper arrived, she launched a campaign to have him removed. She scoured the HOA handbook, searching for any rule about livestock, exotic animals, or noise disturbances. She complained at meetings, rallied her allies, and even filed formal letters of concern. But Mark had done his homework. The bylaws of the HOA were clear about dogs, cats, and unauthorized structures, but nowhere did it mention donkeys or similar animals. The property, technically, was zoned in a way that allowed him to keep Jasper. Karen's fury only grew when she realized that her usual tactics, intimidation, and paperwork weren't working. That's when she decided to take matters into her own hands. At first, her approach was passive-aggressive. She left anonymous notes taped to Mark's door, written in all capital letters, demanding he remove the animal immediately. She stood at the edge of her yard with arms crossed, glaring whenever Jasper brayed. She even tried to rile up other neighbors by insisting the donkey's noise was keeping everyone awake at night, though most admitted they found it more amusing than disturbing. But when her campaign of letters, complaints, and whispered rumors failed, Karen's behavior escalated. She started trespassing. Under the cover of walking her dog, she would veer suspiciously close to Mark's property line. She peeked into the backyard, snapping photos with her phone. She recorded Jasper braying as supposed evidence of noise violations. And finally, in a move that would set everything in motion, she decided to confront Jasper directly. It was late afternoon on a sunny Saturday when Karen, dressed in her usual uniform of oversized sunglasses and a visor, marched onto Mark's backyard while he was inside. She muttered to herself about unsanitary conditions and neighborhood degradation. Jasper, curious and cautious, watched her approach. His ears twitched, his tail flicked, but he didn't move. Karen stood in front of the pen, hands on her hips, glaring at him like he was some kind of criminal. And then, without warning, she lifted her foot and tried to kick him. The attempt was clumsy and half-hearted, but it was enough to set Jasper off. The donkey let out a loud, startling bray, stepped back, and with lightning reflexes, delivered a powerful kick with his hind legs. Karen never saw it coming. The impact launched her backwards several feet, where she landed hard on the neatly mowed grass, her sunglasses flying off in the process. The sound carried through the neighborhood. A few nearby kids, who had been playing in their front yards, gasped and ran to tell their parents. Within minutes, half a dozen neighbors had gathered, some rushing to check if Karen was okay, others barely hiding their laughter. Karen groaned, clutching her side, humiliated beyond words. Her carefully cultivated image of control and authority was shattered in one moment of donkey-powered justice. Mark rushed outside, shocked to see the crowd and Karen on the ground. He quickly checked Jasper, who was calm again, munching hay as if nothing had happened. Then he turned his attention to Karen, who was already demanding that someone call the police, the HOA board, and whoever was in charge of animal control. That moment marked the beginning of a war that would grip the neighborhood for weeks. Karen, bruised and embarrassed, wasn't about to let the incident slide. In her mind, Jasper was a dangerous beast that had assaulted her, and Mark was an irresponsible neighbor who had brought chaos into their orderly community. But for many of the neighbors who had seen what really happened, Karen's reputation had taken a blow. She wasn't the victim she claimed to be. She had trespassed, provoked the animal, and paid the price. Still, Karen wasn't someone who admitted defeat easily. If anything, her obsession with getting rid of Jasper, and by extension Mark, was only going to grow stronger. And as the sun set that day, with whispers spreading from house to house about what had just unfolded, everyone knew the neighborhood was about to change. The donkey had done more than send Karen flying. He had kicked off a battle that would pit one stubborn woman against an even more stubborn animal, and the man who stood by its side. The stage was set for a clash unlike anything the HOA had ever seen. The fallout from the donkey incident spread quickly. Within hours, everyone in the neighborhood knew about what had happened in Mark's backyard. The story traveled in whispers and chuckles, some exaggerated with each retelling. By the time the tale reached the far end of the cul-de-sac, it was said that Karen had flown 10 feet through the air and landed in a flower bed. The truth, while slightly less dramatic, was still enough to wound Karen's pride beyond repair. She stayed inside for 2 days, curtains drawn, avoiding the stares of neighbors who had witnessed her humiliation. But when she emerged again, she wasn't subdued. She was furious. If Jasper had bruised her ribs, her ego had suffered far worse, and she was determined to get revenge. Karen didn't just want the donkey gone. She wanted Mark punished, disgraced, and forced out of the community entirely. Her first move was paperwork. She filed a complaint with the HOA, labeling Jasper a threat to community safety. In her report, she left out the fact that she had trespassed and attempted to kick him, instead painting herself as a victim of an unpredictable and aggressive animal. She circulated emails to HOA members, attaching blurry photos she had taken of Jasper and citing obscure bylaws that didn't actually apply. Her rhetoric was fierce. "This is a residential neighborhood, not a barnyard. If we allow one donkey, what's next? Cows, goats, chickens." The HOA board, used to Karen's relentless campaigns, sighed but agreed to investigate. A hearing was scheduled and notices were distributed. Mark was both amused and frustrated when he received the letter. He knew Jasper had every right to be there, but he also knew Karen wouldn't stop until she got her way. He decided to prepare thoroughly, gathering zoning documents, veterinary records, and proof that Jasper was well cared for and not disruptive. But Karen wasn't relying on the HOA alone. She worked the neighborhood like a politician running for office. She went door to door, knocking and pleading with neighbors to support her cause. She spoke in dramatic tones about children's safety, property values, and the precedent of allowing livestock in a suburban community. Some nodded politely just to get rid of her, but most were unconvinced. After all, Jasper hadn't hurt anyone, except her, and only because she provoked him. Still, Karen managed to rally a small circle of supporters, a handful of neighbors who either disliked animals or simply didn't want to be on her bad side. Together, they started a petition titled "Protect Our Neighborhood Standards," demanding Jasper's removal. She flaunted the signatures like trophies, even though most came from people outside the immediate block who had no real stake in the matter. As the HOA hearing approached, Karen grew more desperate. She called animal control, claiming Jasper was neglected and possibly dangerous. When an officer arrived for a surprise inspection, Mark cooperated fully. The officer found Jasper in excellent condition, clean, healthy, and with more than adequate shelter. The case was closed almost immediately, but Karen spread the rumor that animal control had been concerned and keeping an eye on the situation. Her tactics didn't end there. She filed a noise complaint with the city, insisting that Jasper's brays were constant and intolerable. The complaint was dismissed after a brief review. Recordings from Mark's backyard showed Jasper brayed no more than any average dog barked, but Karen used the rejection as fuel, telling neighbors that bureaucracy always sides with the troublemakers. Through it all, Jasper remained oblivious to the storm swirling around him. He trotted around the pen, munched hay, and occasionally leaned his head over the fence when children came by to pet him. To many in the neighborhood, he became a symbol of resistance, a gentle creature caught in the crossfire of Karen's vendetta. Some even started referring to him affectionately as the community donkey. The day of the HOA hearing finally arrived. Dozens of residents crowded into the meeting hall, curious to see how it would play out. Karen came armed with binders of documents, stacks of printed photos, and an almost theatrical presentation about the dangers of farm animals in residential spaces. She spoke for nearly half an hour, her voice rising in pitch as she described Jasper as if he were a wild beast rather than a placid donkey. When it was Mark's turn, he calmly presented his evidence. He showed that the bylaws didn't prohibit donkeys, that his property was properly zoned, and that Jasper was harmless and well cared for. He reminded the board that Karen had trespassed and caused the incident herself. Several neighbors stood up to testify in his favor, describing Jasper as friendly, quiet, and beloved by their children. The board deliberated for nearly an hour before reaching a conclusion. They ruled in Mark's favor, stating there was no violation of the bylaws and that Jasper could remain. They issued a warning about trespassing, though they didn't name Karen directly, and recommended that all disputes be handled through proper channels in the future. The room erupted in mixed reactions. Mark's supporters clapped politely, while Karen's face turned a shade of red that bordered on purple. She gathered her binders with trembling hands and stormed out of the hall, muttering about corruption and incompetence. But even as she left, everyone knew this wasn't the end. Karen wasn't just angry. She was humiliated, again, and humiliation was something she could never tolerate. If the HOA wouldn't back her, she would find another way. The following days proved her determination. She doubled down on her campaign, but her tactics grew bolder, even reckless. She began stalking the fence line, phone in hand, waiting for any excuse to record Jasper making noise. She spread wild rumors about diseases carried by donkeys. She even left a pile of manure in a paper bag on Mark's porch, though everyone knew it hadn't come from Jasper. Mark, for his part, tried to stay calm. He took extra care to document everything, snapping photos of Karen when she trespassed, saving emails, and keeping a log of her harassment. He suspected it might come in handy one day. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was building towards something bigger, something more dangerous than petty complaints and HOA hearings. And he was right. Because Karen, in her obsession, was about to cross a line that would set the entire neighborhood against her once and for all. Karen's defeat at the HOA hearing should have ended the matter. For most people, it would have been enough to let the issue go, especially after being publicly overruled. But Karen wasn't most people. To her, the decision wasn't just a setback, it was a personal betrayal. She convinced herself that the board had been swayed by lies, that the neighbors who testified for Mark were conspiring against her, and that Jasper's very presence was an insult to the values of the community. She began to isolate herself from the wider neighborhood. Where she once walked with self-appointed authority, patrolling for rule breakers, now she lingered in the shadows of her own bitterness. Curtains drawn, lights dimmed, she stewed in her anger. When she did emerge, it was only to escalate her war against Jasper and Mark, and soon her tactics turned from paperwork and gossip to sabotage. The first incident happened late at night. Mark awoke to Jasper braying loudly, a frantic sound unlike his usual calls. Rushing outside with a flashlight, Mark discovered someone had tossed food scraps into the pen. The donkey, confused but unhurt, nudged at the strange pile. Mark cleaned it up quickly, recognizing that the spoiled leftovers could have made Jasper sick. He had no proof, but he didn't need it. He knew exactly who had done it. The next attempt came days later. Mark noticed the latch on the gate to Jasper's pen had been tampered with. It looked as though someone had tried to force it open, though the sturdy lock had held. If Jasper had gotten loose, it could have been dangerous, not because the donkey was aggressive, but because wandering into the street could have led to an accident. Once again, Mark documented everything, snapping photos, writing down the dates, and tightening his security measures. Neighbors began to notice Karen's increasingly erratic behavior. She was seen loitering near Mark's property at odd hours, muttering under her breath. She made dramatic complaints to anyone who would listen, describing Jasper as a ticking time bomb and insisting that it was only a matter of time before he attacked again. Her tone grew more desperate, her claims more outrageous. At one point, she even insisted that Jasper's braying was ruining property values and scaring off potential buyers. But the turning point, the moment everything changed, came on a breezy afternoon when Karen decided to act directly against Jasper once more. She waited until Mark was out running errands, then slipped onto the property with a garden rake in hand. She muttered to herself about taking care of the problem as she approached the pen. Jasper, sensing the intrusion, shifted uneasily. His ears flicked, his muscles tense. Karen raised the rake, jabbing it toward him through the fence. She wasn't strong enough to hurt him badly, but the intention was clear. She wanted to frighten him, to drive him into a frenzy, perhaps even create an incident she could use as evidence. But Jasper wasn't a mindless animal. He reacted instinctively, braying and kicking at the fence with enough force to rattle the wooden posts. The sound carried down the street, drawing attention. Several neighbors came running, phones in hand, recording the scene. They caught everything: Karen jabbing the rake, Jasper defending himself, and her angry outbursts. When she realized she was being filmed, Karen panicked. She dropped the rake and began shouting at the neighbors, accusing them of harassment and claiming she was merely inspecting the safety of the animal enclosure. But no one believed her. The footage was undeniable. Word spread quickly, and soon the entire neighborhood knew the truth. Karen wasn't the victim she pretended to be. She was the aggressor. That night, a neighborhood meeting was called, not by the HOA board, but by the residents themselves. Tired of Karen's constant meddling, lies, and dangerous behavior, they gathered in a neighbor's garage to discuss what could be done. For the first time, Karen was no longer in control of the narrative. People spoke openly about her harassment, her trespassing, and now her attack on Jasper. Parents voiced concerns about their children's safety, not from the donkey, but from Karen's escalating instability. Meanwhile, Mark tried to stay composed. He didn't want revenge, he only wanted peace. But he also knew that ignoring Karen had only emboldened her. He presented his log of incidents, complete with photos, dates, and the new video evidence neighbors had captured. By the end of the meeting, the mood was clear. Something had to be done before Karen's obsession spiraled further out of control. The following week, the HOA board, pressured by the growing unrest, issued an official warning to Karen. They cited her trespassing, her harassment, and her inappropriate conduct toward Mark and his property. It wasn't expulsion. HOAs rarely had the authority to force someone out, but it was a serious reprimand. For someone who had long seen herself as the enforcer of the rules, it was a devastating blow. But rather than backing down, Karen took it as a declaration of war. She ranted to anyone who would listen, claiming the neighborhood had turned against her because of a donkey. She wrote furious posts on community forums, painting herself as a martyr. She even threatened legal action, though no one took her seriously. Her obsession consumed her. She no longer cared about other HOA violations, no longer patrolled the neighborhood for trash cans or crooked mailboxes. Every ounce of her energy was directed at Jasper and Mark, and as her behavior grew more erratic, the community's patience thinned. The breaking point arrived on a warm Saturday evening when the neighborhood gathered for a small block party. It was a tradition, a way for families to relax, grill food, and let their kids play together. Mark brought Jasper to the edge of the yard, letting the children pet him while parents chatted nearby. For many, Jasper's presence was the highlight of the evening. But then, as if drawn by her own anger, Karen appeared. She stormed into the gathering, shouting about bylaws and unauthorized livestock. Her voice rose above the laughter and music, silencing the crowd. She marched straight toward Jasper, her face twisted with rage. Before anyone could stop her, she raised her hand as if to strike him. But Jasper, startled and protective, lashed out with another powerful kick. This time, the impact sent Karen sprawling onto the pavement in front of the entire neighborhood. The party erupted in gasps and shouts. Parents rushed to cover their children's eyes, while others pulled out their phones to capture the chaos. Karen, dazed and bruised once more, scrambled to her feet and shrieked about lawsuits and animal control. But it was too late. Everyone had seen her aggression, her recklessness, and the donkey's natural defense. There was no hiding the truth anymore. The neighborhood had reached its limit. Karen's reign of intimidation was over. But as the dust settled that evening, it became clear that her final act of defiance would have consequences far greater than anyone imagined. The block party incident marked the end of Karen's grip on the neighborhood. In that single moment, with dozens of witnesses and multiple videos circulating online, her authority crumbled like a house of cards. By the following morning, the footage had spread across social media. Neighbors who had once kept quiet about her antics now spoke freely, emboldened by the undeniable evidence of her behavior. The HOA board called an emergency session. Though their authority was limited, they could no longer ignore the chaos Karen had caused. They gathered in the community clubhouse where residents crowded the room, murmuring in anticipation. Karen arrived late, hobbling slightly from her latest injuries but still defiant. She carried a thick binder under one arm and wore her oversized sunglasses as if to shield herself from the judgment of the crowd. The meeting was tense from the start. The board presented the evidence, the videos of Karen trespassing with the rake, the testimony of neighbors, and the footage from the block party showing her charging at Jasper before being kicked. Each piece chipped away at the facade she had tried to maintain. For years, she had hidden behind rules and bylaws, twisting them to her advantage. But now the truth was laid bare. Karen tried to defend herself. She claimed the videos were misleading, that Jasper was dangerous, and that she was only protecting the neighborhood. But her voice cracked under the weight of disbelief in the room. No one supported her. Even her small circle of allies had quietly distanced themselves, unwilling to be tied to the spectacle she had become. When the board announced their decision, the room erupted in quiet gasps and relieved whispers. Karen was officially removed from all HOA committees, barred from participating in neighborhood governance, and issued a final warning. Any further harassment or trespassing would result in legal action. While the board couldn't force her to sell her home, they had stripped her of the power she had wielded for so long. For Karen, it was the ultimate humiliation. In the weeks that followed, Karen became a ghost of her former self. She rarely left her house, and when she did, she avoided eye contact with neighbors. The once proud enforcer of community standards now lived in self-imposed exile, her reputation shattered beyond repair. Children whispered about her like she was a villain from a story, while parents shook their heads at the memory of her tirades. Meanwhile, the neighborhood began to heal. Without Karen's constant interference, residents felt a new sense of freedom. Lawns grew a little less perfect, flower beds reflected personal taste rather than uniformity, and laughter returned to the streets. For the first time in years, the community felt like a place where people actually wanted to live, rather than a neighborhood trapped under the weight of strict enforcement. And at the center of it all was Jasper. The donkey had become a local legend. Families stopped by to feed him carrots, children drew pictures of him in school, and neighbors joked that he should be made the official mascot of the block. His calm presence and comical brays brought a sense of charm to the area that no manicured lawn ever could. Even people from outside the neighborhood started visiting, curious to see the donkey that had taken on an HOA tyrant and won. Mark remained humble through it all. He never gloated over Karen's downfall, though he had every reason to. He simply continued to care for Jasper, grateful that the neighborhood had rallied around them. He often reminded others that Jasper wasn't a fighter, just an animal defending himself when pushed too far. But to the neighbors, Jasper was more than that. He was a symbol of standing up to unfairness, a reminder that sometimes the simplest beings can teach the biggest lessons. As for Karen, she never fully recovered from the ordeal. Her name became synonymous with overreach, her antics remembered with a mix of frustration and humor. Whenever someone tried to stir up unnecessary drama, the neighbors had a ready phrase: "Don't go full Karen." It was both a warning and a joke, a reminder of the time when one woman's obsession nearly tore apart a community until a donkey sent her flying. Months later, as summer turned to fall, the neighborhood held another block party. This time, the mood was lighter, freer, filled with laughter and the smell of barbecue. Jasper stood at the edge of the yard, surrounded by children feeding him treats and brushing his coat. Parents chatted nearby, grateful for the peace that had finally settled over the block. For Mark, it was a moment of quiet satisfaction. He looked around at the smiling faces, at Jasper munching happily, and at the neighborhood that had finally learned to unite against tyranny. He realized that what began as a battle with an overbearing neighbor had ended as a victory for the entire community. And though Karen remained tucked away in her house, curtains drawn as always, everyone knew she had been defeated. Not by Mark, not by the HOA, but by the stubborn, steady kick of a donkey who refused to be bullied. The war was over, and the neighborhood was better for it.